Welcome to the Drawn from History, Art Inspired by Archives video panel discussion with Cambium Arts and Surrey Archives. My name is Joe. I'm the Assistant Archivist at Surrey Archives. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that we are honored and grateful to be on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Salish peoples, including Katsi, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo nations. Just a quick rundown of what will happen today. We're going to have a panel discussion, and then we'll open the floor up for questions if there's any. And then we'll go down the hall to see the artwork, and then at 3 p.m. there will be a reception across from the halls at 3. So please join us there as well. And just another heads up, there is no planned fire alarms. So if fire alarms do go off, please stay calm and follow the instructions from the staff members and evacuate the building. Great, so I think I will start by introducing myself and then pass the mic down the row, and we will all take turns introducing ourselves and basically also the group that we're part of. So once again, my name is Joe. I'm the Assistant Archivist at Surrey Archives. I oversee outreach, programming, and reference services. Surrey Archives is the official repository of City of Surrey. We preserve and provide access to civic records and community records that were donated by Surrey residents.
Thank you, Joe. My name is Stacey Gilkinson. I'm the archivist for the City of Surrey Archives. And so what that means is I write our grant applications, oversee our collections, and also the administration of the archives.
Hi, folks. My name's Irv Newcomb. I'm one of the artists that is the collaborative team known as Cambium Arts.
Hi everyone, my name is Amalis Hawk and I'm also part of Cambium Arts. And Irv and I also wanted to just quickly acknowledge that we are on Semiahmoo, Katsi, and Kwantlen territories that are unceded, unsurrendered, and ancestral. And for us as settlers, we always just talk a little bit about that at the beginning, about taking responsibility as settlers on this land. And that means that we try to practice solidarity with Indigenous people, including Indigenous land and water defenders on a day-to-day basis, striving towards solidarity because we feel that's an ongoing process that we strive towards, and to be, as much as we can, accomplices in their struggle for self-determination.
So I'm just going to go to the first prompt. And so my first question would be for each team, what drew you to this partnership? For Cambium Arts, what drew you to apply for the project in the first place? And for Archives, what drew you to the collaboration?
You want to start, or would you like to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, what drew us to this project, I think, is the intersection of archival work and history and art and community engagement. You know, we've kind of got a history of, no pun intended, of working within all of those. And yeah, it was just a really lovely opportunity to try and expand some of our work in those areas.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Irv was saying, I think that another part of it, for us, another aspect was the really great call that came from Clayton Community Centre and the Surrey Archives, which talked also, if we look at what Surrey Archives has been working on in terms of their principles around equity and decolonizing the archives, which has been an ongoing theme in our work in terms of looking at and really, I think, bringing to light stories that are either forgotten, sometimes can be hidden inadvertently, that need to be brought to light in various ways, and to bring those histories, particularly in Surrey and Clayton, to the surface and to celebrate them.
All right, so from the Surrey Archives side, we believe this collaboration really reflects our mission statement. And our mission statement is to keep the memories of our communities alive and increase the understanding of each other. And really, we wanted to, through this collaboration, push past these stereotypes of archives where a lot of people, first of all, don't really know the concept of archives. But if they do, they think it's very much only academic and only students and professors and historians go, and those are the only people that end up at the archives. And honestly, archives can be very intimidating to a lot of community members, especially those from historically marginalized groups. So we believe this is a very much creative, artistic, and easily digestible way of approaching archives and really open up the doors and ease people into being more familiar with archival materials.
Yeah, just to add to what Joe has already discussed here, I think when I was first contacted about this idea of having an arts collaboration with archives, I thought, well, we're exploring all these ways to improve access to the collection. This is a unique and innovative way to provide access. So really, Cambium Arts here has demonstrated and created this very unique and innovative way to engage with the collection, to highlight stories that are often marginalized or not brought to light nearly enough to tell the story of Surrey's past. In particular, what I noticed about the Cambium Arts application is just that there was that emphasis on wanting to highlight stories from marginalized communities, and that is very much something that we support.
What were your team's goals for collaboration within this project? Maybe we'll start.
I think, I'll build on what they've already said in terms of we wanted to generate interest in the archives and perhaps more broadly interest in history of the area. And, I think we were drawn to the fact that there was this diverse community here and that it wasn't just recent, that there historically has been a very diverse number of communities and that there was a lot of respect and cooperation between them. So I wanted to, I think, with Hummel, do what we could to kind of highlight that and hopefully use that as a foundation for people so they can understand that and interpret future things that way as well. And build the kind of future that I would hope for Clayton.
Yeah, I think I agree on that. And I think, again, building on what Irvin, Stacey and Joe have talked about, the importance of, people understanding that the archives, and I thought this too, and, it's still something that I'm learning more about, is that the archives are not just for academics or for people who are scholars of a particular kind or for really like formal research for people's dissertations, et cetera, that the archives belong to all of us. And I think in many ways, our communities actually, speaking particularly of like, Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color, I think for immigrant communities in particular, understanding the process of archives, but also understanding that we have our own living archives for our family stories and histories, and that how important it is to preserve those is, I think, something that's been really important that drew me to this, because when I think about my own histories of migration in my family, I've moved many times across many continents. And, for people who may take for granted when they've lived in one place that they have their family pictures, they have like these generations going back and records. And, in my family as South Asians who have been impacted by things like partition of India, big displacements that have happened, right, internally and externally. And so we don't always have that documentation, those histories and those photos that people might take for granted who haven't faced that kind of migration or displacement for various reasons. So I think that the archives can bring us back to our kind of community collective histories in ways that we maybe haven't realized as people who are not scholars or academics, and that has been really beautiful for me. For example, I've been reading a lot about how Indigenous people are reclaiming archives, even though it can be very hard and difficult because often the images, and we've had really good frank conversations when we first started with Stacey and Joe about this, images of Indigenous communities or other racialized communities can be really difficult in terms of what's available in archives because they're often from that external, usually colonial perspective. Right, and so how important it's been for Indigenous people, for example, who are starting to reclaim archives, to find the stories of their own families and communities. It can be very hard to do, and we can talk about that during the challenges piece. I think on a personal level, it can feel very hard to do, but it's critical. And I've also have another arts residency I'm working on in US around housing insecurity, and so that was kind of my first experience with archives. You know, I walked into the US Archives and there was a young Black archivist, and I was like, whoa. And she was like, whoa. And she looked at me and we were like, oh my God, I didn't expect you. And I didn't expect you. And we had this amazing conversation about how part of the reason the archives are usually from a white dominant perspective is because as racialized people, you know, either our histories were weaponized against us or they weren't welcomed in or seen as important, right? They've often been erased for various reasons throughout history. And so the importance now, even now, about who's contributing in terms of what was happening in the US archives, who comes in, who brings in photos, who brings in records, they don't usually represent the kind of racial, multi-ethnic background of that community even. So for me, I think that's been a big part of this collaboration, is that this beautiful kind of synergy of having those same goals of ensuring that the archives are really not just decolonized, but I think demystified and available for everyone.
Absolutely, that's a really great comment. Thank you so much. Because on our end, our goal was obviously to raise our profile in a sense that a lot of people are not aware that the city of Surrey has archives, and and also, as I've mentioned previously, that Surrey Archives also have community records that were donated by Surrey residents, and by having our sort of more multicultural or sort of those like representative images in more bigger sort of community space, we were hoping to really reach a wider audience. And Stacey will also go into detail about this, but we really wanted to showcase that our history isn't just about that white colonial early settler history, and obviously those histories are part of our collections, but we definitely do have a lot of sort of multicultural and historically marginalized communities groups records, so that we wanted especially those community members to feel comfortable and connected by looking at the archival images that are featured in artwork, and could be surprised, like, oh, I didn't realize Surrey Archives had images or records of my community. And then hopefully that could sort of lead into more sort of collaboration and connection with those community members.
Yeah, Amal, as you were speaking, I was saying, yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I think from this collaboration, along with this being a point of access, I think to highlight the marginalized stories is so important, as well as sort of invite the public to engage with archives as a profession, as well as the Surrey Archives collection. Archives in Canada are not neutral. Many people who are less familiar with how the historical record are formed might assume that what's in the collection is all that happened or a full representation of history, and that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, the Surrey Archives collection was created to document the history of the municipality, both the governing structures and the community, but the municipality only goes back as far as 1879, and of course the land here has a history that goes back to time immemorial, and there's many other ways of knowledge keeping. Archives is just one. So really, our hope for the collaboration, I know when we were putting together, or I was seeing drafts of the call, I really wanted to ensure that there were examples from the collection that would encourage people applying to think beyond the white colonial settler narrative, and I think that came across, which is good. But really wanting to invite public engagement to think more critically about the historical record, the biases that exist, biases very much in favor of that white settler narrative. and also take a look at the way in which our staff are really trying to address those silences in the collection, and the work that's taken place, and also how much further we have to go in achieving equity and the journey towards all of that.
Thank you so much. I wanted to add, if that's okay, something that I wanted to say and forgot is that, yeah, I mean, I'm nodding too, lots of nodding going on. I think two things I wanted to say is just, you know, like to just make it more, like, even more real is how I think the concept of like, just, you know, when you think about archives and popular culture and what we see like in films and stuff, we see people wearing the gloves and coming in to handle these delicate documents. And I think it was very exciting for Irv and I when we got to, for example, when Stacy and Joe brought out the preemption map of Clayton, which is what, how old? One of the earliest ones, 1819. We finally got to wear the gloves and handle this document. But you know, there's something so beautiful that at the same time that archives are seen as very mystical or like being for people who are scholarly, etc., that you can come in as a member of the public and actually handle this precious, beautiful document that is so old, and how amazing it is to literally hold history in your hands. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that for me, personal inspiration has also come from, you know, some years back, I was asked and commissioned by the Vancouver International Bhangra celebration, which is based in Surrey. VIBC does incredible work, and they were doing a celebration for the 100-year centennial, so the centennial of the Gadar movement, which was a movement locally that was an anti-colonial movement, interfaith, Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh, South Asian early settlers across the Pacific Northwest, and it went all the way to San Francisco and was connected to the Black Panther Party eventually, etc. So incredible movement that did a lot of work around supporting the Kamagata Maru and the Shore Committee, like a history that in Surrey, particularly in South Asian communities, is very well known. But what was missing from that, really, and has often been missing even in those celebrations and acknowledgements, has been the story of like women and also early South Asian Muslim settlers. And I'm a South Asian Muslim, so this is a real passion of mine. And so to be commissioned, it was such an honor and both quite intimidating to be asked to write a historical poem as a poet about that movement and to do the research to bring those lost perspectives in and those lost voices, and to do that in front of basically like living historians. You know, there were descendants of people from the Kamagata Maru and other parts of like early South Asian Muslim families that have been here for generations. Like everybody that is anybody in South Asian communities in Lower Mainland was there. And for me, that was like the kind of like, not the first, but kind of the more formal foray into blending history and historical research with art. And I really did feel that I was haunted by that poem, because I would wake up sometimes at 3 a.m. and I felt like these women were like calling to me, and that there were multiple hands involved in writing that poem. And it was in that moment when I performed that poem to such a supportive audience, and to be able to then speak to some of the descendants of these early South Asian families, that I realized the power of archives and history and blending that with art, and how it made people feel so seen.
I'm aware of our time. Is there a question that you would really like to talk about in the ones remaining? We have about 15 minutes before, maybe 5-10 minutes before I'd like us to go see the artwork.
Can I make a suggestion? Maybe we could shorten the reception a bit, because there's not a lot of people. So could we maybe take
That's
a...
what you prefer?
How do you feel about that? Good? Sure. Yeah, would you feel okay?
Sure. I can just go to the next.
What's that? Okay. Yeah, we can still shorten the questions, but maybe just give it a little tiny bit more time. Okay.
I'll go to the next one.
Sure.
All right. So next one was, what was the process like in developing the artwork Memories and Futures? Cambium Arts, how did you select the content, such as the fabrics and the photos that would be showcased? Where did you start? Were there any challenges and exciting discoveries? And for archives, how does someone access the collection, and what do you want to see showcased from the collection? Why don't we start with Stacey?
Actually, this is something that Jo
Yes.
knows all about. She's the main reference point.
I was just picking a person.
That's perfectly fine. So yes, for anyone who's actually now aware of Surrey Archives, I'm like, oh, I'm actually interested in learning about the collections. I like to let everyone know that we are one of the few archival institutions in Lower Mainland that offers walk-in hours. That means you do not have to make appointments. So we are open Tuesday through Saturday, 9:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. So literally come to us, walk in, ask us questions, and we're there to help you. We also have readily accessible resources on site that when you walk in and have questions, we can definitely pull them out. So we have books on history of Surrey, as well as diverse communities such as Who Was Who book by Michael Hoshiko, who wrote about a Japanese Canadian families who lived in Delta and Surrey, as well as the Stolo Salish historical atlas that were put together by the Indigenous nations to really bring the history of what the land was before, I guess, the history of Canada. We also have reference files. Those are collections of newspaper clippings, ephemera related to different subjects, and we have over 200 of them. It's a really great place to start. And then we also have some of the newspapers and council minutes, keyword searchable, and of course, friendly staff who will be there to assist you in your research journey. We also have some online tools that you can look up. We have online database called Surrey Online Heritage Search. We have nearly 150,000 photographs that are viewable online. We also have time lapse. This is like pinning old archival photos on the modern map, so you can kind of have this then and now effect. So it's really cool. We also have 1949 and 1966 aerial layers on maps, so you can also see the overall development that Surrey went through. So we have a lot of abundant resources that you can reach us to. And honestly, I personally really wanted to showcase some of more, I call it recent history, because a lot of people also think archives only deal with ancient history that's pre-1800, but I really wanted to showcase some of more like photographs from the 1980s and 1990s to really tell people that archives is not just about old history that's all done and dusted. It's a continuing story, and it's also keep growing with the collections that we have. So really wanted to highlight those.
I think just what I'd add to that very quickly is, yes, we really want anyone to be able to come into the archives. All you need is a question, and we're more than happy to help you out. As Joe was saying, we really want people to understand that Surrey's history is continuing. We're living history right now, and so it's really the full scope of the story is what we're hoping to reflect in the collection.
Yeah, I think this is a really big question. I think Irv and I definitely had a vision. It was really great to come in and see what, the archivist kind of recommended. We did use a photo that was actually in the call out of the Inouye family, of Tom, the son. And I think that after that it emerged, Irv and I think for us as Cambium Arts, a very specific vision that we had of what we wanted to see. And we really wanted to, in terms of picking archival images, we wanted to like show as much as possible people's joy and resiliency, or like, kind of like, I think even resistance, or like standing up. For example, we have a picture of Tom and Oyo, so we have a family. His father was one of, if I understand, the only Japanese Canadians in this area to actually get his land back after internment. We felt like that was a really important story to talk about, because when you look at the archives, we do see racialized communities, in particular equity denied communities, and kind of like, because of the ways in which the history has been informed, in very subjugated positions through a gaze that is very much the gaze of the oppressor. And I think we wanted to shift that narrative. So when we were looking at pictures, there were some, for example, excellent pictures of like Black community members, a young Black girl that we looked at, which really appreciate was brought to our attention, and she's surrounded by white kids and they look happy. At the same time, for me, I had a visceral response as someone who has been the only brown kid, right, in a situation, in like a class or a school, and how that can also feel isolating, even if I looked happy. So for us, instead, we chose to go with kind of more, I think, images from the 90s, I believe it is, that we found, because there were very few actual like images to find that we could blow up in the archives of Black community members that were actually reflective of Black joy. We're Black people surrounded by other Black people. So those are the kinds of, I think, subtleties to now how we approach communities that are really important. So it was a lot of work to try to figure out and have to paint, for me, in terms of doing the primary research on photos is to, sometimes you can plug something into the archives or you find files, which the archivists are great in helping us find. You find a great story, but to actually get a picture that has the resolution to be able to reproduce it can be really challenging. You may not be able to find that. So I had to painstakingly go through the search engine and literally look through every category and spend hours and hours, because if I would put in Black people or if I put in different keywords, not much would show up. So it was like going through with a fine-tooth comb, trying to find that one clue. And in fact, with some of the Black community pictures of, like, you'll see the gravestone, we went and found that ourselves. So we went outside the archives. We physically went to locations, you know, and some of the pictures of Indigenous communities that we weren't able to find in the Surrey Archives, we went further. So even though we were beyond our hours for the residency, we just really were determined to make sure that we had representation that felt respectful. So I think that is kind of like what we looked at. So maybe Irv can talk briefly about the fabrics and how we kind of came to that. Any other challenges and discoveries you want to talk about?
Sure. Yeah, the fabrics came from a whole variety of sources, donations, our own collection, family, friends, some we purchased. We tried to kind of find fabrics that were representative of the culture and the communities that are represented on the imagery on the other side of the panels. Yeah, that was about it. We did find some amazing images in the Surrey Archives. It was, you know, I can really encourage people, if you have any kind of interest, do follow it up, because I certainly learned a lot. I didn't know that there were oil rigs in Surrey at one time. I learned about railways and how those, you know, help the development that you see currently. We found out about oyster harvesting, predominantly by South Asian labor in Crescent Beach. You know, a wonderful Black church that was established on land that was donated by a Japanese farmer that existed until 2019. You know, so really wonderful stories that are carried there. So yeah, follow it up.
I guess I have one more thing to add about the challenges of the collection. Is due to past collecting practices. To give a little context to the Surrey Archives, the archives themselves weren't created until 1976, and we had some civic engineers actually who were doing some of the very earliest collecting in the 1920s through 60s, not with an archival background, all of them white men, and very much they were going to people who they thought of as important to the history of the city and the community. And so some of those early collections, while they do say have some Indigenous content, often the context isn't there. They did not record the nations, the locations, the individuals, and there's you know, questions about consent as well. And so as archivists, we take that very seriously. But it's also exciting to be able to work on projects that that are more focused on collaboration with communities rather than talking about them. It's history about them with them, and that's incredibly important. I want to save some of that discussion for the future panel discussion questions that are coming up.
Okay, let's go to the next prompt. So this one, I like this one. I'm excited. What does equity mean to your teams? So for Cambium Arts, what does equity look like in your artistic work? And for Surrey Archives, what does equity look like in archival work? And what challenges do archives face in achieving equity? Do you want to start this?
Actually, why don't we hear from the archivist on this first, and then we'll come back, because we started the last one. So
Oh, sorry.
switch it up, yeah.
For sure. So when I think about an equitable archives, I imagine a collection that reflects everyone in the community, the full history of the community, as well as not just about the collection, but really expanding outside of that and thinking about in terms of access, who has access, how easy it is to access that history. With the collection as it is, we're really turning towards making more resources, more guides. One thing that is really important in equity in archives is recognizing that archives traditionally have not been equitable by any means. There's this term that emerged through the work of June Chow, Jennifer Douglas, and Rebecca Sheffield, all archivists, who created a blog post on the Association of Canadian Archivists page called Archival Debt. And the idea of archival debt is there's this past harm, erasure, marginalization that has happened. And so archives owe it to the communities that they serve to resolve those issues and actually not just work to form partnerships, but partnerships and activities and projects that actively benefit those communities. So we're in the midst of some of that work right now. The project that comes to mind is our current oral history project, Amplifying Voices, in which it's entirely focused on recording the lived experiences of individuals who identify as BIPOC or 2S LGBTQ+, and doing that with community organizations so that we understand what the community needs are, the information that they want to be preserved about themselves, and also working with each individual who's being interviewed and understanding their needs, making sure they consent along the way to every aspect of the project and feel really honored and respected throughout. We currently have the first set of oral histories with the queer community and advocates in Surrey that's up on the city's YouTube channel, so please do check that out. It's been really exciting to get feedback on that process and also see the other projects that's now leading to.
Great. I'll actually add on some of the challenges that we do face. Surrey Archives is very fortunate to be funded through the city's operating budget, but we're still very much of a small team, which is the reality for a lot of archival institutions, and that means everyone in the team has to wear multiple different hats and do many different take on many different responsibilities. Like, for example, with myself, I oversee reference services, outreach and programming, scheduling, creating programs and delivering them. So we can't just sort of designate a specific time or location or project just to work on something like equity related. What we do is we try to blend our work related to equity in a lot of the different roles that we play, so that it's sort of a continuing project instead of we'll just have a specific deadline for one specific project that's just dedicated to equity and we'll never look back. That's not how we do it. We just make sure it is incorporated in our daily operation and services.
Yeah, I think this is a very big question that could probably take many years to answer, and not just one panel, but I think that, in summary, the first thing I'd say is that for Cambium Arts and for us as collaborators, Irv and I, like, our foundation is that we don't stop at equity. We're always striving to, towards decolonization. I don't think those are necessarily the same things, so I think they're important, but I think equity is a starting point, and the aspiration is decolonization. So I think that's important. And it's important to name that, and I think it can make people uncomfortable, but I think that's another kind of foundational thing for me in my work. Foundational principle is that, sometimes pushing for the truth and bringing that out in the arts, because I think as artists, we do have a role. We can be just making art for the sake of art, which is also important, but also as an artist, and particularly for me coming from a tradition of artists and poets, from the cultures that I come from that have always been catalysts for change and witnesses to history and shifting that. It's really important to embrace the importance of truth-telling, and that sometimes you're going to come across challenges internally, externally, bureaucratic challenges, other challenges, where when you are pushing for the truth, it can be difficult, and you can face challenges with that, but it's so important to do. And so what I always tell young artists in particular, I do a lot of work with newcomer youth, racialized youth, young women of color at different panels and talks that I do or workshops, and one of the things that they always ask me is like, what's the key to success? And what I say is, embrace your career limiting truths. And they're always like, what do you mean? And I'm just, what I say is, don't worry If people tell you that speaking the truth and pushing for the truth, or really pushing to ensure that there's proper representation of people, or that you need to bring those kind of like hidden histories to the surface, whatever you might be working on, that you're pushing too hard and you're never gonna get that artistic gig or that next residency or that next job because you're speaking and trying to push for the truth. Embrace that. Embrace career limiting truths, because there's always going to be an opportunity where you will actually be able to continue your work. And in fact, the more you are living your truth and in it, the more that's going to happen. So I think that really opened up for us in this residency, and it was really this beautiful feeling. It sounds a little woo-woo, but the moment we actually went and found for ourselves the picture of the Scott family, one of the earliest Black families in Surrey, and found their gravestone because there were no photos of them to be found, it was really, I think, a moment, because when we got there, there happened to be an Indigenous funeral, they were singing the Women's Warrior song, and it just felt like the ancestors of all of these communities were actually encouraging us to do this work. And after that, we then found, we were really missing having like pictures that felt that they were coming from a place of respect of Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Kwantlen community members. So we pushed further beyond our residency hours, although we'd already done those, we were out of time, we were out of money. We were like, we're doing this work. We're going to make sure this representation happens beyond like a blank panel representing the community. And suddenly, after hours of calls and emails and repeated calls and emails, the archivists from like Langley, Maple Ridge, and White Rock suddenly got back to us. So it felt like the stars were aligning, and that was because we were in our truth, and we had pulled back enough to kind of realize, okay, looking back at this work right now, we have an obligation here to ensure that the host nations, for example, are really well represented. So I think for us, equity in our work is really seamlessly bringing in that commitment to truth-telling, whatever that looks like in the moment.
Wow, I don't have much to add to that. Other than, yeah, I do believe that it is an artist's responsibility to always seek truth and integrity, and there's no recovering your integrity once you lose it, so you do need to be careful. And so I think, it's an ongoing process. Interrogate what you're looking at and your own intentions as you move forward, and just keep looking for improvement, opportunities to improve how you do your work, how you work and engage with people. And obviously there's an opportunity for equity concerns to arise between Amal and I based on our respective positionality in the world as well. So, as a white person, I see it as my obligation to use my privilege and my artistic skills, whatever those may be, to move that whole process forward. Thank you.
Yeah, and I know we're short on time, but I do want to add this because I think it's important, is that, in terms of archives being accessible, what I loved about when we were looking for images like beyond the Surrey Archives of Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Kwantlen community members that actually did feel respectful, was that we found most of them on the social medias of these other archives, like Facebook, right? Which was really amazing, because then what happens is when you have these pictures posted, like of the Pierre family, which we'll look at after, an incredible family. Again, we picked pictures where we felt like Indigenous people, and again, we're bringing that as a non-Indigenous perspective for sure, but we're Indigenous people. It felt like, there's pictures of veterans, for example, from World War II, and the Pierre family who did seminal work around colonialism and challenging that, going all the way to England, for example, to challenge the monarchy at the time around the ban of potlatches and other Indigenous really central traditions. But what I loved about that is that when you go on those Facebook posts, there's like members of the Pierre family, descendants, who are like, oh, that's my great-grandmother, and she was this really playful, wonderful woman, etc. So when you have the archives popularized onto social media and into popular culture, you actually get descendants, and on all three of those photos and the posts about them, family members were actually responding, which I thought was really beautiful and helped reinforce for us the idea that family members are actually really, really happy about these photos. So I think you want to wrap, or?
We do have question that we could answer, or we can go and look at the artwork together. It is totally up to the panel.
I'm open. What do you think?
Can't remember the question.
I mean, if people seem restless, we can go, or what do you have a preference? Or if you want to get it on record, we can. I don't remember the last question. I think
It's another equity.
it's an equity
Future.
I think it's looking to the future.
Yeah.
We could do brief.
Probably
We can keep
so.
our answers
Sure,
brief.
yeah.
We'll do.
We'll do a quick
Okay.
response.
Response to this one here. Okay, so what does equity look like now in your practice? What do you want it to look like in the future, and how do you plan to achieve this?
So what equity looks like now in our practice is so many of our projects, our priorities are focused on filling those silences in the archives collaboratively. At the stage, we've built really positive relationships through the Amplifying Voices project, through some of our programs, and looking for community alignments as well, as I was speaking to on the last question. One that comes to mind is we found out that there's this Indo-Fijian Cultural Society that had been formed in Surrey. And I don't think either Joe or I were aware that there was this prominent Indo-Fijian community within Surrey. And we met with the organizer and found out that there is this, sense within the community of there's an identity of being from India. There's also the Fijian indigenous identity, but there's not so much this sense of an Indo-Fijian identity. And there was a desire to interview elders who had immigrated to form that sort of basis of identity creation. And so that was really powerful to be involved with. Something else that we're currently working on is putting together source books. So oftentimes there's information about different communities who have been marginalized in the historical record, but it's scattered across the collection or even at other institutions and still relates to Surrey. And so compiling all of that into one resource so that we aren't asking people to spend hours upon hours researching has been really, really impactful and well received. So we've got a South Asian source book that deals with the South Asian history here in Surrey. We've got a draft of an Indigenous source book that will be provided to the 3 land-based nations. We've worked in the past of providing inventories of what we have as well to local nations as well as Indigenous organizations in the past. And so continuing that work, I don't think the archives will achieve equity in our lifetimes, but what we want to do is keep moving the needle, keep identifying needs and where the collection is not representing the community, and continue to address those as much as we possibly can.
Sure, and I can just add on to something very quickly is that we're also focusing on educating young professionals who enter our field so that this conversation around equity in our practices is honored and continued throughout basically the generations to come. So we host Young Canada Works interns, and then the projects that we assign them is describing and also redescribing some of the photographs or records that will be made accessible online to make sure that we train them to be sensitive and compassionate and knowing what are the correct terms or what are the right terms to use and what are the terms that are triggering and outdated and something that we don't use anymore. So it really is also something we do reach out, but also inwardly we train our staff to make sure that equity is something that's really embedded into our practices.
This is another one of those really big questions. I think that, equity is, very much, has always been a part of my work. So I think that's beautiful because it's unconsciously and consciously, there's just like so seamlessly woven in that I think that I don't necessarily have to have like specific plans to bring it in because it's always there. And I really appreciate that about our collaboration, Irv and I as well. I think in terms of archives, one of the things that I think was not a challenge, but hard for us is that we found so many amazing images of so many different communities that we wanted to showcase, but physical limitations in the space of like hanging and anchors in terms of what was available allowed us to only show a certain amount. And that, you also have to work with practical things like budget constraints as an artist, right? Having these images blown up and then fabrics, etc. planning all of that, and doing all of the kind of hardware, all of the work. So all of the rigging, everything for this took quite a fair amount of time. So I think that what I'd love to see, if we're dreaming about futures and equity, is that the pictures that we still have and the images that we have from this from Surrey Archives, but also some of the ones from other archives, I'd love to like kind of expand in the future and do another installation, but also think about ways to because the work we do is so community engaged, right? And we are arts educators with a lot of experience. I think find ways to also work with the archives in different ways, with particularly the community, and bringing those archives to make new creations that blend in the archives in a hands-on kind of way. So I think there's a lot of, we're talking about what might happen in the future with some of the other images that we found. Maybe there's a conversation with the Surrey Archives about that, because we're definitely dreaming up what's next, because we've now been bitten by the archive bug, and we just think it's like so important, right? We've had conversations with people doing the community engaged parts of our residency, where we did work with the kids for potato stamp and lino cut. You're going to see a panel out there. We'll talk about it, because the installation that we did is called Reclaimed Memories, Inclusive Futures, and so we have a panel that came from a number of community engaged sessions with particularly children and their parents and families, multi-generational families working with us sometimes with potato stamps, lino cuts, and also a community mural. And what came out of that is the conversations we had with people also about the archives, and people being surprised. Oh, I'm a new immigrant from Hong Kong. And I've just moved to Clayton. I didn't realize that Chinese communities have been here for so long, and that there's this picture up there about, that's of Chinese people. So just that kind of awe-inspiring moment for people where they're like, wow, our roots actually depend, even, as new immigrants, we think are really fresh, but go back a long ways. So I think that is for us, the goal is to continue to make this accessible, but to continue the excitement that we have and kind of share that and encourage and grow that in the community. I think that's it.